This is the second part of the three-part series that I'm creating on the depth study on Germany from 1918 to 1945 for the CIA iGCSE history course. So the first video, we covered the first key question, which is about the Weimar Republic and whether it was doomed to fail from the start. The second key question is going to be a little bit longer. It covers the same time period roughly, but instead focuses on events that are happening parallel to the events which we discussed in the last video, and that is the Nazi rise to power. So this topic is going to track the origins and the founding of the Nazi Party from Hitler's joining of the party in the early 1920s and trace it up until the eventual takeover of Germany by Hitler in 1933, and then finally his consolidation of power in 1934. Okay, so the topic ends up being quite long because each of these three parts of the topic are areas which you could get quite a wide range of questions surrounding. Even for that very first topic, the growth of the Nazi Party into 1923, you can get obviously a range of 4 and 6 mark questions, but you can even occasionally get some 10 mark questions on events like the Munich Putsch. The bulk of the topic, however, tends to be about the second and third topics, which are how he eventually becomes Chancellor by 1933, and then lastly, how he consolidates his power by 1934. However, as I said, all three of these topics are potential examination questions, for which you could get a wide range of questions within your exams as well. So we're just going to get straight in basically, and we'll see how long this video basically goes on for. So this topic basically begins with Hitler's early life and his career. Now, I will say you're unlikely to get a question specifically about this. However, there are a few aspects and details of his early life that I think are important for you to understand, because they help to inform and explain events that take place later on and why certain things happen. So the first thing is, as you guys will mostly be aware of, Hitler is not, of course, born in Germany. He's born in a small town in Austria on the borders of Germany and Austria. And his family is not from a particularly wealthy or poor family either. So he's from a sort of lower middle class family. His dad was basically a civil servant, like a low-level clerk. He has some savings tucked away, but they're not doing brilliantly. They're living sort of very simple, small town life. Now, both of Hitler's parents die when he's still young, which obviously has an effect on him later on in his life. And when his parents, at the same time as that, he is, throughout his childhood, someone who struggles academically. So when his parents die, he leaves his town of Branau. He goes to Vienna. He tries to become an artist, which was basically his passion, his sort of main skill and talent. However, when he goes to Vienna, he's unable to get into art school because his particular art style, I mentioned this I think at the end of the last video when we discussed Weimar art, just wasn't particularly popular at that stage of time. He was mainly somebody who enjoyed drawing sort of buildings and landscapes, whereas art was sort of starting to push his boundaries a lot more and basically taking on sort of additional meanings and, focusing on, human paintings and things like that. I'm not a particular expert, but that's my kind of rudimentary understanding of it. When he goes to Vienna, he's unable to get into art school. He therefore becomes homeless, and he spends several years basically either sleeping rough on the streets or having to gather a few, any sort of like coins he can to basically sleep in a hostel overnight and get by for a couple of days. Does that for a few years, and then in 1913 he then moves to Munich, and it's in Munich in Germany where he's in Munich in Germany when the First World War breaks out, which means that when the First World War breaks out, he joins the German army in the First World War. Now, while he's in the army in the First World War, he gets awarded an Iron Cross for bravery, and he was, from what we understand, a fairly effective soldier. So he's very quickly promoted to a corporal when he's in the army. And so, yeah, he basically has a pretty good time, given that he had previously been homeless and he'd sort of been struggling. This is really the first time in his life where he's basically got a real purpose, something to kind of fight for, really try to work towards. And so when the First World War comes to an end, if you remember from the last video, we talked about how a lot of right-wing nationalists and soldiers were really upset with the nature of the First World War. And so Hitler is one of these many right-wing nationalists who, when he finds out about Germany's surrender at the end of the First World War, is genuinely furious. And then to add insult to injury, of course, there's the Treaty of Versailles, which again we mentioned last video, many Germans were really angry and upset about, and he's one of these individuals. Not anyone particularly special, just one of this large group of, as I say, right-wing nationalists who are really angry at the end of the First World War and believe that some sort of conspiracy had taken place. When he comes back from the First World War, before he left for the war, he wasn't doing anything particularly important or interesting in his life. So when he comes back, he doesn't have anything to go back to. And so instead, he works as a spy on local political activists after the First World War. The army had basically recruited several ex-soldiers to do this, who were basically unemployed after the Treaty of Versailles, reduced the size of the army. And he's one of these individuals. And so as a consequence of this work, he ends up attending meetings of a small group called the German Workers' Party, the DAP. Now, again, I mentioned this at the start of last video, or towards the beginning of the last video, that after the First World War, Germany had a very large range and wide variety of political parties who were operating, who, for a variety of reasons, had issues with the nature of the new Weimar Republic, either for sort of right-wing nationalist reasons or sort of left-leaning socialist communist reasons. And so the DAP, the German Workers' Party, is a really small party that literally has a few dozen individuals attending small little meetings at the back of beer halls and pubs in Bavaria, in Germany, in Munich. And he basically attends it, and he attends these meetings to kind of watch what they're doing and report back to the army. When he attends these meetings, he finds that he's actually quite interested and attracted by the things which he's hearing at these meetings. So he starts attending these meetings as a spy in February of 1919, but then by September of 1919, he then joins the party and becomes a full-fledged member. Now, the key thing to note here is therefore that the Nazi Party, or its original incarnation, is not created by Hitler. It's created by a person called Anton Drexler. And so in terms of what the DAP basically was at this point in time, they were effectively a right-wing nationalist party with a slight twist. As you can tell from the name, Workers' Party, it had some slight socialist inclinations that I'll touch upon in a little bit more detail in a moment. But the main idea is in terms of their core beliefs. Like other right-wing nationalist parties, you have the same range of common beliefs and principles. Number one, that the violent politicians who overthrew the Kaiser and basically accepted Versailles were traitors and were therefore subjects of hate. They also hated democracy because they believed it to be a weak system that had made Germany weak and sort of, compared to what it was like before the First World War. And lastly, a very common staple of right-wing nationalist thought and belief is that they also hated the Jews for a variety of reasons once again, but one of them being that they believed that the Jews were part of this global, this grand conspiracy to try and undermine Germany. And so, these sort of three common threads that tended to flow through all of the right-wing nationalist parties, generally speaking. But then the Nazi Party in 1920 comes up with this essentially manifesto called the 25-Point Program. Okay, it's released in February 1920. And so the 25-Point Program really gives us an idea of what the Nazi Party is in its early years and when it's initially founded, or what the DAP rather was. And essentially, what you get is a mixture of two types of ideas. On the one hand, you have nationalist policies and ideas, and on the other hand, you have socialist ideas. And this is where we get the name of the party, the National Socialist German Workers' Party. Now, a lot of you I thought that's already, and will know that these two ideas, nationalism and socialism, on a really simple political spectrum, you tend to think of them as being on opposite ends of the spectrum. So socialists are on the left and the nationalists are on the right-hand side. And so that's therefore contradictory. And the truth is, it is somewhat contradictory, and even more so when we look at some of the other beliefs which the Nazis had, Hitler in particular had. But they had these two beliefs. On the one hand, they were nationalist, okay? That meant specifically, and if you look at the 25-Point Program which they released, they had the following policies that could seem to be nationalist. They first of all believed that all Germans, that's a typo there on the slide, all Germans should be part of a greater Germany. So Germany after the First World War had lost territories, some of which had within it German-speaking peoples, and that Germany had to expand to include within it all territories that had within it German speakers. They also believed in expanding the size of Germany just to have colonies and create an empire, in particular in Eastern Europe. Within this would then exclude other racial groups from the German nation. Okay, so for example, it meant excluding people like Jews and also Slavic peoples when they eventually intended to conquer Eastern Europe. The Slavs were a population that you found in large parts of Eastern Europe, like Poland and Russia, for example. Lastly, they wanted to create a strong central government led by an all-powerful dictator. Again, so no more democracy, no more sort of weak Weimar Germany, essentially. Now, on the flip side, they were also genuinely, in some ways, a socialist party. Okay, so if you look at the 25-Point Program, it had a couple of clauses in it that were very socialist if you listen to them, if you look at them. So number one, they believed that the state had a primary duty to promote work for its citizens, basically make sure that every single person's in work, and ensure that everybody had a good livelihood and could essentially subsist and look after themselves. They also believed in increased state control over the economy, which again, if you've got a good understanding of socialism, you know that's basically a pretty socialist principle. And that also included and extended to the nationalization of some industries. So again, a staple, really common core principle of socialist ideas. So they genuinely were a mix of both of these two things, despite this feeling that those two things are somewhat contradictory. They don't necessarily have to be. They're just thought of being that way on the traditional political spectrum. So they come up with the 75-point program by February 1920, or by 1920. But really, what helps the Nazi Party grow is the membership of Adolf Hitler, who was a very charismatic individual. Now, on the one hand, if you look at his background, he's not the kind of person you would expect to be able to ascend the political ladder and become the leader of a major country. However, he has the one gift or trait that you genuinely need to have if you want to be a successful politician, and that is bags and bags of charisma. So he was genuinely really passionate speaker. And he was able to communicate his ideas in a really clear and effective way. So if you've ever seen the videos of Hitler, you'll notice that he has those really crazy hand gestures and movements and, the things above his head and all that kind of, quite comical, clownish behavior. But actually, that was a big part of his appeal. And the hand gestures were not random, were not something which he did off the cuff. He tended to actually rehearse those physical gestures. So you might actually find there's this famous photo shoot of Hitler where he's sort of like in a studio, black screen, and he's sort of posing in these sort of weird ways, which is sort of like a propaganda effort. But again, that's something he tended to do. He tended to go to locations where he was going to speak, and he'd practice his speeches, make the hand gestures, and he was very deliberate about it. He was also, in terms of his speaking style, really clear and very simple as well. So he wasn't explaining really complex ideas and processes and economics and whatnot. He tended to have just very simple messages. In particular, they often were quite negative and targeted Germany's enemies. So he'd often focus on the same common themes. So the November criminals, e.g. the politicians who betrayed Germany in the First World War, communists, Jews, all these different people who Hitler believed were involved in this great conspiracy against Germany. And so, as a consequence of Hitler's charisma and speeches, the Nazis are able to gain or pick up 3,000 members by the end of 1920. And therefore, they've now got a real political party, essentially now, as opposed to just a bunch of old men meeting in the back of a beer hall. The party therefore needed greater organization. And so you start to see this again over the next few years. So by 1923, the Nazi Party has become a significant political force, specifically in Bavaria. Okay, across the rest of Germany, the Nazis would not have been a particularly well-known or prominent political party, but in Bavaria specifically, they had become quite well-known and quite prominent. There's a few kind of reasons why this happens and a few aspects of this. So the first thing is that the Nazis, again, just to illustrate how much they had grown, were able to create their own newspaper, the People's Observer. They bought the People's Observer, which had a circulation of 17,000 copies. And they also created their own paper later on called Der Stürmer. So the Nazi Party now has two newspapers that are in circulation across Bavaria with relatively wide readership. Hitler also, by 1921, because of his ascendancy in the party, forces Drexler to surrender control of the party in 1921. He forces a leadership contest, which he wins, and basically unseats Drexler as a consequence, because ultimately he was the future of the party, not Drexler. And when he does that, he then starts to bring in several powerful individuals and allies into the party who are quite helpful and useful when it comes to, again, expanding the popularity, the reach, the organization of the party. So if you kind of big individuals who come into the party, you first of all have a guy called Hermann Goering, who ends up being a very prominent figure of the Nazi Party up until the end of the Second World War, who's sort of from a very wealthy aristocratic background, but had famously been a First World War fighter pilot. Towards the end of the war, they actually brought in planes that were able to fight. He was actually quite a decorated fighter as well. You then get a man called Ernst Röhm coming in. Remember that name? He's a really important, a very, very, very important individual. And he's basically a very popular ex-army officer who, again, is very popular amongst ex-soldiers. And he'll later on become the leader of the SA as a consequence. And then, crucially and very importantly, in terms of the early development of the Nazi Party, is that he becomes friends with a person called General Ludendorff. And so General Ludendorff, if you know your First World War history, was the head of the German army in the First World War. That's why the big push that the German army makes at the end of the First World War is called the Ludendorff Offensive. So this is a very significant and senior figure within Germany. And so to gain his friendship is a massive victory for Hitler, or is a big boost for the party, and he'll play a key role in the Munich Putsch in 1923. Lastly, as a reflection of all of this, the Nazis now have 50,000 members, and as a consequence are regularly hosting these large-scale rallies and events and meetings that are being attended on a regular basis by thousands of people. And so by 1923, the Nazis are now becoming a genuine political force in Bavaria, and are known by most people in the city of Munich, for example. In addition, by 1923, the Nazis also have their own private militia or army called the SA, the Sturmabteilung. A terrible German pronunciation, ignore it, but we're going to call them just the SA. Also are nicknamed sometimes the brown shirts due to their uniforms. So the SA are the brown shirts because the brown uniforms. The SS later on are referred to sometimes colloquially as the black shirts because they wear black uniforms. And so Ernst Röhm, who we already mentioned, is put in charge of the SA. Again, do not forget that. It's really important detail. Now, it's worth mentioning that, and again, if you watched the last video already, that this is not a unique phenomenon in German politics. Because of the nature of how violent and unstable Germany is in the early 1920s, many other political parties also have their own private army. So the SPD has theirs, the communists have theirs. And so they're generally always used for the same range of purposes. So the main purpose is to provide private security for your own events, and ensure that no disruption takes place and no issues, whatever. But the SA, unlike the other private armies, are also much more active in disrupting the meetings of other parties and opposition meetings, basically. And as a consequence, the SA had a reputation for causing trouble and being quite wild and thuggish in their behavior, because a lot of what they did do was intimidate, attack other parties and meetings, stir up trouble, etc. So by 1923, you now have the SA picking up or having membership that runs into the thousands, and they also had access to a hidden store of weapons as well. So as a consequence of these two things, the growth of the Nazi Party and its organization, and additionally their popularity, along with the growth of the SA, this now means that by 1923, Hitler finds himself in a position to try and make a bid for power in Germany, which takes us to the Munich Putsch. So by the end of 1923, Hitler decides to try to overthrow the Weimar Republic in an armed revolt, which ultimately is unsuccessful. Now, you can get a wide range of questions about the Munich Putsch. You can get questions about what happened, events of the Munich Putsch, as well as reasons why it took place, reasons why it failed, consequences and outcomes, as well as just 10-mark questions on, again, outcomes or things like that. So in terms of why it happened, I think the easiest way to think about it is by dividing this up into long-term reasons and then short-term reasons, or sort of medium/short-term reasons. So if you have to get a question about this, the first thing which you can talk about in terms of why Hitler tried to do this is very simply that long list of grievances which we've talked about in the previous video that right-wing nationalists had with the Weimar government, So there was this long list of grievances which we talked about building up between 1823, so the Treaty of Versailles, the instability in Germany, economic struggles, etc. And this meant that right-wing nationalists like the NSDAP, the Nazis, had become quite popular. And so as a consequence, we're in a position to attempt to try and overthrow the German government. That is number one. Number two, as a consequence, this also included leaders of the Bavarian state government, and so the Bavarian state government, so this is where I'll talk about it in more detail later on, but the leaders of Bavaria were also these sort of right-wing nationalists who were unhappy with the nature of the Weimar Republic's rule in Germany, which you're going to mention last lesson. Many right-wing nationalists opposed the Weimar Republic. And Hitler believed that because they despised Weimar, he believed that he could get the Bavarian government on side to support an overthrow attempt against the German government. There's a really crucial detail. So Hitler thinks he'll be successful, and you'll see later on when we look at the details of the Munich Putsch, it might seem bizarre how he's effectively trying to force these politicians to back his putsch. His reason for thinking that will work is because he knows these individuals already dislike and despise the Weimar government, and therefore he thinks they'll come on side with a bit of coercion to kind of to convince him that he's the person to lead that revolt. So these are sort of your that's your first long-term cause, and your sort of consequences that the Bavarian government can be brought on side. And the final thing which you can talk about is that the context of the Munich Putsch are the crises of 1923. So Hitler is again convinced to pull off or to attempt this coup in 1923 and thinks it'll be successful because this is a real moment of weakness for the German government. Okay, you first of all have the Ruhr invasion and the issues which that brings about, followed up by the hyperinflation crisis. And so Germans are bitterly aggrieved. Weimar is weak. And so Hitler genuinely believes that this is the right time to exploit those feelings and really make a push. And he thinks genuinely he will be successful. There are some other factors you can look into in terms of what he was inspired by. I'm not really going into it because it's a bit complex. But if you want to look into it, he was essentially trying to emulate a plan by Mussolini, which he used to take over Italy not long before that. So in terms of the events of the putsch, this can be a relatively confusing event. So I'll try to keep things relatively simple because ultimately most you'll get in terms of the events is a 4-mark question, but you just need to know some of the other details in terms of why it fails. So the Munich Putsch begins on the evening of the 8th of November 1923, where there are these Bavarian officials, the leaders of the Bavarian government, meeting in a beer hall addressing the leaders of other right-wing political parties. Now, the 3 individuals here involved are a man called von Kahr, who's the leader of the Bavarian government itself. You have a guy called von Caesar, who's the head of the police, and then a guy called von Lossow, who is the head of the Bavarian army. So you've got the head of the government, the head of the police, and the army chief. I'd say the main name to remember is Kahr. If you can't remember all 3, don't worry about it. But I'd say just try to remember the name Kahr, because he's really the main player involved in this. And so Hitler is able to gain the support of General Ludendorff, we've already discussed beforehand, as a Nazi supporter now, and convinces him to support his plan to overthrow the German government and restore dictatorial authoritarian rule. So he enters this beer hall while this event is going on. He enters it with some of his SA guards who are all armed with machine guns, and he takes over the beer hall by force, and he then takes the 3 leaders of the Bavarian government hostage at gunpoint, and he then makes them support his revolution to try and overthrow the German government by sort of starting a revolt from Bavaria. Now, obviously, being forced to do this at gunpoint, the 3 men then agree to support Hitler's plan, but it's basically forced. That thing that I talked about earlier about Hitler thinking that they actually would genuinely back it because of their own dislike of Weimar, they're not. They're forced to do it. At the same time, the rest of the SA under Rome march over to the police and army headquarters in Munich and take over those 2 locations. And the idea being that with the government now on side in Bavaria and the army HQ and police HQ under SA control, Nazi control, the next day the Nazis would march on Berlin in an event modelled on, as I say, Mussolini's march on Rome when he took over Italy in the early 1920s. However, this plan does not immediately go to plan either. So although they capture the main army HQ and the police headquarters, the main army barracks in Munich resists the SA assault, and it stays in the government's hands. Now, most worryingly and most problematically is that in the evening of the putsch, Ludendorff is convinced by the leaders of the Bavarian government to let them go and go home, basically. They convince Ludendorff that they're trustworthy, they are fully on board with this plan, and he can basically release them and they won't do anything strange or betray the Nazis. They, of course, instantly betray Hitler. They immediately call the government in Berlin, inform them what's going on, and they order the army in Bavaria into action to try and put down the rebellion. And so almost immediately that night, the putsch goes wrong, and it's basically on life support. However, by the morning, despite that massive setback, Hitler decides he still wants to go ahead and with the planned revolt and the march which he had planned to try and basically get the march on Berlin. His rationale was that we're really popular. If we go into the streets, we've been attracting these rallies of thousands and thousands of people. People are extremely upset with the government, and so they will come out into the streets and support us, okay? So he goes ahead with the plan despite the initial problems that are taking place, hoping that people will come out to support him and they can still proceed with their march on Berlin and overthrow the government. When he gets to the square in Munich, or to the city square, Hitler is met by the state police and the army, who then open fire on the Nazis and the SA and scatter their march. In this scuffle, Hitler is basically I think has his arm dislocated. A couple of others are shot, and the rest of them basically flee before eventually being captured and arrested by the police in the days afterwards. So Hitler and the other leaders are eventually captured and arrested within a few days, and that brings the Munich Putsch to an end, and it's basically unsuccessful as a consequence. So, if we look at those events, why does the Munich Putsch fail? There's a few reasons. The first thing is that the Munich Putsch clearly had very poor organization. So, the first example of this is the fact that Ludendorff releases the Bavarian leaders, despite the fact that they were being held hostage to try and make them support the Munich Putsch. So, had he not released them, things could have gone a little bit differently, potentially. The second issue is, of course, as I already mentioned, part of the plan was that the SA had to capture these key locations across Munich. They had failed to capture the main army barracks, and that therefore meant that, again, the plan was on life support from the very beginning. So the first reason is poor organization. They released the Bavarian leaders, and the SA can't capture the main army barracks. The second reason is that Hitler underestimated the loyalty to Weimar of the Bavarian politicians. And as I said beforehand, it was not unreasonable to think that they could be brought on side. Okay, there was even, from what we understand, genuine plans being floated by these three individuals of potentially overthrowing Weimar before Hitler even came up with this idea. So it was something they were actively thinking about anyway. So this was a genuine possibility. But in the end, they decided to stay loyal to Weimar, and therefore that means that the putsch fails as a result. The final reason is that Hitler clearly overestimated the support which he thought he was going to get. Basically, he was drinking the Kool-Aid. So he genuinely thought to himself, having watched himself, deliver these speeches at these massive rallies with thousands and thousands of cheering supporters and adulation and, everything else, he genuinely believed that the people would come out and support him. And it is genuinely true that the Nazis had grown in popularity over the course of the early 1920s. However, nowhere near enough to gain the sufficient popular support required for their armed revolt. And so for these three reasons, the putsch ultimately fails. Now, I've seen in the past 10-mark questions about the consequences of the Munich Putsch, and in particular, you get questions sometimes about the extent to which the Munich Putsch was a failure, which may seem like a bizarre question. His aim is to overthrow the German government by force. He fails, and in fact, he goes to prison, as I mentioned in a moment. However, there is a way in which you could argue that in the long term, the Munich Putsch is to some extent a success, or at least has benefits for the Nazis. So the obvious reasons for failure, if you were to get this question, is that, or the way in which is a failure, is first of all, the putsch fails. And that's obviously a significant setback for Hitler's attempts to try and take over Germany. That's number one. The second thing you could obviously say is that not only does the putsch fail, but Hitler ends up being sentenced to 5 years in prison, and the Nazi party, the NSDAP, is also banned as a result. So he's now as far away from his ultimate aims as he could possibly be. On the flip side, however, there's some positive consequences that emerge from the Munich Putsch. So the first positive is that it leads to the Nazis making a strategic decision to switch away from attempting to overthrow the German government by force, and instead to try and use democratic methods to take power instead by building a party with nationwide support. This is a success because eventually this will work. So it's obviously what convinces Hitler to adopt the strategy which eventually works. The second thing is the trial of Hitler and the Nazis ends up making the Nazi party significantly more popular and gives them a national profile for the first time. So up until the Munich Putsch, Hitler and the Nazis have become relevant and popular, but only within Bavaria, which is a large region, but it's only one region in Germany. The trial of, when Hitler goes on trial and the rest of the Nazi leaders, this gives him a lot of national publicity. He gives quite a few powerful speeches in the courtroom where, he gives his right-wing nationalist message. And to some people, it's a really popular message, not least because it's still the year of 23 when there are all these different crises that the government's still recovering from. So as a consequence, the Nazis, despite being banned, in 1924 contest elections under a different title, but it's essentially the Nazi Party, but with a different name to kind of escape the ban that they've basically been put under. And the Nazis gained 32 seats in their very first election, despite Hitler being in prison, because the trial of the Nazis, because of the putsch, gave them publicity. So it failed in the short term, but long term made them nationally relevant. Lastly, you could also argue that it basically gives Hitler the time and the space to sit down and refine his ideas, and he does this by writing, or let's say rather reciting, his book Mein Kampf, which basically allows him to, say, further refine his political ideas, which also then, when he releases it, helps the Nazis to further publicize their beliefs. So if you get that as a 10-mark question, it may seem quite tricky, but there are these genuinely, I think, quite straightforward points you can make for and against the Munich Putsch having positive and negative consequences for the Nazis. Now, what happens to the Nazis after Hitler emerges from prison? So, as I said, when he's in prison, he writes his book, or rather has it written by one of his allies who's with him in prison. He writes or creates his book Mein Kampf, and within Mein Kampf, you start to get Hitler reiterating and expanding further on some of the ideas that he had obviously been pushing in the early years of the Nazi Party. So in particular, a lot of the racial issues, so he really kind of fleshes out in more detail his belief and concept of the Aryan race and the master race, or Germans rather are the master race, and that Jewish people are involved in a conspiracy to undermine the Aryan race and to also dilute their blood and things like that. Additionally, a lot of Hitler's foreign policy beliefs are expanded upon. So he basically talks a lot about how Germany has to reverse the Treaty of Versailles, and that Germans needed Lebensraum, so living space, to expand into when they expand as a nation. And to do that, they should invade and colonize Russia to basically turn it into a large colony and to also use it for agricultural land and things like that. He continues to double down as well on some of the more socialist principles. So he talks about how industry and land should benefit working people, not wealthy landowners and industrialists. He again consistently talks about democracy, how it continues to be weak, and how Germany needs a strong leader instead of having this weak democratic system. And he also talks quite a lot about traditional family values. So he talks about in that first video how Weimar culture, on the one hand, is quite forward-thinking, quite liberal and modern, but on the flip side, it gained a lot of it caused a lot of tension within Germany, in particular amongst individuals who thought that new Weimar culture was quite degenerate. And so Hitler talks a lot about his rejection of what he considers to be degenerate forms of art, music, and theatre, and instead his support for, as say, traditional family values, traditional styles of art, music, etc. Now, when the Nazi Party, when Hitler comes out of prison, because it's now a national party, the party now also needs to be organized nationally as well. So Munich, as the place where the Nazi Party is originally founded, becomes the central hub of the Nazi Party and where its party headquarters is based. The rest of Germany then gets divided into 35 regions, each with a local leader, and each region having its own local leader. There's a German name for it, Gauleiters or something like that. I'm not going to try and keep using that phrase because it's a bit difficult to pronounce. But crucially, I mention this because this division into 35 regions is what leads to the rise of some very, very prominent figures across Germany. So if you can become the leader of one of these regions, that's a position for you to then use as a launch pad to become a more prominent figure yourself nationally. The best example of this is one Joseph Goebbels, who again, the name will ring a bell, very significant figure. Goebbels becomes the Gau, or the leader of the Nazi Party in Berlin, and from that position he's able to gain quite a lot of national prominence. Now, this is where you also start to get the beginning of a shift of the Nazi Party away from their socialist leanings. They are still a socialist party. However, at this time, the Nazis are able to increasingly make links and gain support from wealthy industrialists and businessmen who were nationalist in character and principle. So two very famous ones, whose names will ring a bell if you know the modern day companies. You had businessmen like Tyson and also businessmen like Bosch. Yes, the modern day company. Who were these very, very wealthy nationalist businessmen who were convinced by the Nazi message and decided to give them quite large donations. So as a consequence of these large donations, the Nazis are now able to start organizing the party nationally in a more effective way. However, when the Nazi Party starts to grow nationally, you start to get more splits emerging in terms of their general principles and ideas and beliefs. And so in particular, because Germany is a country with a range of different regions and places, depending on where you are in the country, you might have a different emphasis and have different views or beliefs. In particular, the north tended to be more urban as a sort of like region and more industrial. And as a consequence, the Nazis in the north tended to be a little bit more socialist in their inclination, and they emphasized that much more, in particular because they're trying to gain support of industrial workers. Whereas in the south, particularly in Bavaria, Germany was still quite rural, and this southern rural part of the party tended to be more nationalist and focused on that aspect of the program instead. So in 1926, this divide comes to a head, and Hitler calls a party meeting or conference in Bamberg. It's called the Bamberg Conference. And at this meeting, Hitler decides to make a move against the socialist wing of the party, who he denounces, and he basically almost like accuses of being effectively communists, which, if you know what socialists are, they are close to communism, so it's not the wildest thing for Hitler to try and claim or say or do. And so he denounces the socialist wing of the party, and as a consequence, he weakens the socialist principles of the party in favor of a greater focus on the more nationalist, divisive message, in particular, blaming the enemy forces hurting Germany. So blaming Jews, blaming communists, etc., as well as starting to prioritize farmers, basically agriculture, as a support base, and policies which could potentially be tailored to farmers in the agricultural sector. So you start to see this now shift towards the Nazis being a more rural agrarian party in terms of their support base. You also get the emergence, as I say, of Goebbels at this conference in Bamberg, where he becomes a key ally of Hitler. Now, initially, Goebbels is actually one of the more socialist urban Nazis. However, he goes to Hitler's side at Bamberg, and from that point onward becomes a very close and key ally of him. Hitler then rewards him by making him the Nazi leader in Berlin. So I mentioned earlier, he was leader in Berlin. This is after the Bamberg Conference. So from 1926 onwards, we now have the rise of Goebbels as a prominent party figure within the Nazi party. And so whilst Goebbels is in Berlin, he starts to develop his use of propaganda, which he kind of perfects which he then starts to use obviously more effectively later on when he becomes Minister of Propaganda when the Nazis take over Germany. But in particular, he starts to develop a lot of the ideas which you'll be familiar with from Nazi propaganda later on. So first of all, he organizes quite a lot of large-scale rallies in Berlin, where he himself delivers quite a few speeches. Again, a method he uses later on to quite strong effect when the Nazis take over Germany, and also when they're campaigning nationally as well. He also produces these very simple campaign slogans, propaganda posters that can be communicated quite easily to people. He's also quite keen on staging events and photo opportunities and things like that. So just these very simple, basic propaganda techniques which he's starting to kind of develop and perfect whilst he's leader of the Nazi party in Berlin. In addition to that, the Nazi party, in addition to that aspect of the reorganization, the Nazi party also expands significantly the SA and also creates a new sort of rival body in the party called the SS. So the first thing is, the SA has significantly expanded by 1930 to 400,000 members. Okay, so this is now a massive organization, which at one point actually has more members than the Nazis have voters potentially. He also sets up, as I say, this group called the SS, which in German translates to the German meaning, or the German name translates to Protection Squad. And as the name suggests, it's designed to be a smaller organization or body. And as a consequence, it has more specially selected members. They have to be Aryan, all the members, and they act as Hitler's personal bodyguard. As I said earlier, with the whole brown shirts thing for the SA, the SS famously wore black shirts, which made them actually a lot more intimidating to look at as well in terms of their uniforms. And they get placed under the command of someone called Heinrich Himmler. Again, a name which you should be aware of. He's one of the two main individuals underneath Hitler's command. And the SS has 3,000 members by 1930. So again, it's a more focused and small group compared to what the SA is meant to be. Now, so if you look at what happens after the Munich Putsch, the Nazi party becomes nationally prominent. They reorganize and become, really large, and they appear to be a significant national force. However, despite the rapid development and growth of the party after Munich, they were actually moving backwards as opposed to getting closer to their goal. So in the election of 1928, this is the first election the Nazis contest after Hitler has come out of prison. They end up receiving less than 3% of the vote. Okay, and I can't remember the number of seats that is, but it's essentially less than half the peak the Nazis had achieved in 1924. So when Hitler was in prison, they got double the number of votes and seats that the Nazis had achieved when he came out of prison and made this large nationally organized party. So the party was moving backwards despite objectively becoming larger and more organized. In addition to that, again, further evidence of their lack of success, I mentioned this in the last video as well, the Young Plan, one of Stresemann's key policies in the late 1920s or agreements with America, the Nazis end up organizing a referendum alongside the DMVP to try and vote down and stop the Young Plan from coming into effect. That fails completely. Over 90% of Germans vote in favor of the Young Plan. So across any measure you look at in terms of political success, the Nazis are struggling and moving backwards, not actually moving close to their goals. And the three main reasons for this, which again you can get in your exams 6 markers about why the Nazis failed to succeed before 1929. The very first and simple reason is that this is the Stresemann era, okay, the golden age. Whatever you think about it, we discussed this last video. In the golden age, or in this period of recovery, most extremist parties are struggling and losing support, the Nazis in particular. This is because Stresemann's policies have stabilized the German economy, and his foreign policy successes have improved Germany's standing. These are the two main arguments used by extremists to try to undermine the German government and gain support for themselves. And these two arguments have now been undermined by Stresemann's successful policies, whatever you think of this sort of success. The second thing is the Nazis were struggling to gain the support of the the industrial workers who were largely supporting the SDP, or if they were, angry workers, they supported the Communist Party. And this is arguably due to the ideological shifts which took place at Bamberg. So the Nazis have now shifted away from their socialist messaging, and instead they're now focusing more on the nationalist side of things, which can get you supporters, but this traditional support base their original base of support was industrial workers in places like Bavaria, and the messaging of the party was just not going to cut it in terms of getting support from these types of individuals, which you can blame on Bamberg, basically. The third and final reason you can actually come up with, I think explains it as well, is that, we mentioned this last video, Hindenburg becoming president in 1925. Hindenburg really gives legitimacy to the Weimar Republic, in particular amongst right-wing nationalists. He himself is a right-wing nationalist. He's a German war hero. And so with him at the head of the government, it makes it more difficult once again for the Nazis to take these accusations of the government being led by these traitors, these sort of like this Jewish conspiracy undermining Germany's government, when the head of the government is the leader of the German war, one of the German generals from the First World War, who's considered to be a war hero. And so you end up having a further weakening of extremist parties who wanted to end the Weimar Republic, because the Weimar Republic is now headed by a significant German figure with a lot of respect and sort of like credit in the bank with that faction of the war, with that part of the country. So up until 1929, they're doing terribly. Between 29 and 32, the Nazis now get their big break and are able to become the party which Hitler wanted them to be in the first place. So by 1930, the Nazis have now increased their support to 18% and 107 seats in the Reichstag. They are now the second largest party in the Reichstag. By 1932, Hitler has now transformed the Nazis into the largest party in Germany and the Reichstag. At one point, they gain 37% of the vote, which translates to 230 seats in the Reichstag. This is largely due to outside events, in particular the Wall Street crash and the subsequent depression. And so when it comes to the reasons why Hitler takes over Germany, this has to begin with the discussion of the depression. However, there are obviously a range of other factors you have to be aware of, because there is a reason why it's the depression benefits Hitler and the Nazis and not other parties. Okay, so let's go through these. This is one of the 2 most common 10-mark questions you can get for this topic. You can also get 6-mark questions asking you why or how the Nazi Party gained support, or 10-mark questions explaining why they became so popular. So this is the real meat of this topic now. So the first reason, as I mentioned, is the Depression. Okay, so to summarize it really, really briefly, you end up getting a collapse in the German banking system following the collapse of the in the USA of the banking system there. Those American banks, now desperate for money and facing bankruptcy themselves, start to desperately demand the return of loans from other countries which they had given out. Now, which country had taken significant loans? Oh, right, Germany. So from that last video, we saw how Germany takes loans after the Dawes Plan, which initially was a good thing, but long-term will hurt Germany because of the Depression. So the American banks start to recall these loans because they're desperate to basically stop themselves from becoming insolvent and bankrupt. And so this crisis ends up leading to total economic collapse in Germany. So you have industries and farms having to scale back their operations or close completely. This leads to unemployment. Okay, now watch this cycle here. So you've got industries and farms cutting back or scaling back because of their own issues. That creates unemployment. The worldwide crisis this global crisis is also leading to a general decline and drop in demand for goods across the world and trade and things like that. That also means you get unemployment, because if there's less demand for goods, it means you're buying less goods from countries. There's therefore less need for workers to make those goods, so they get laid off. So more unemployment. And so because you've got unemployment from these two issues, so farms and industry scaling back plus worldwide the demand in goods dropping, unemployment, that unemployment means there's an even greater reduction in the sales of goods, and further demand for goods internally within Germany drops, which then creates, you guessed it, more unemployment. So you have this vicious cycle where unemployment creates more unemployment, because the key issue here is that demand for goods is dropping, businesses are therefore failing, that creates more unemployment, and the cycle goes on and on. Okay, the consequence of this is that by the end of 1932, unemployment in Germany has reached 6 million. In 1929, it was 1.3 million. Okay, to delve into the numbers a bit more deeply as well, 50% of 16 to 30-year-olds are unemployed, and 40% of factory workers. So certain industries are decimated, or sectors, by the Depression and the economic crisis. Now, the problem here is this in and of itself makes the German government unpopular. But to make things matters worse, the German government does not have any adequate solutions to the crisis, and they actually arguably make things worse. So taxes end up being raised to fund unemployment benefits, which had also been cut. So the government actually cuts benefits for unemployment for workers. They have to raise taxes to pay for these things. And you also get people's savings crashing in value. And so as a consequence, you then also get the decline in real wages, meaning the spending power of an individual. So for example, your wage might stay the same, but if prices increase, that means your real wage decreases. So taxes go up to fund unemployment benefits, those benefits get cut, savings crash in value, real wages are declining, and you also have homelessness increasing. So across the board in Germany, people's living standards are declining significantly, and in some instances are at catastrophic levels. In this consequence, you also now start to see a return to the lawlessness and difficult security situation of the early 1920s. Violence is on the rise significantly, as are crime rates. And this also means that even if you're not somebody who's struggling economically, let's say you're sort of upper class and wealthy despite sort of some struggles, your life is still negatively impacted because there's no security in the streets. So pretty much everybody is experiencing a significant decline in quality of life as a consequence of the Depression. Now, this is where we come back to the weaknesses of the Weimar Constitution, which we mentioned at the start of the last video. Okay, so if you've watched that again recently and remember those details well, this will all make sense. So the German government is, even in like the best of times, can struggle to govern effectively, but in difficult times, basically find it impossible to govern. And the government ends up being paralyzed by the crisis and unable to deal with it. They come up with some very unpopular policies, which as a consequence, they can't get through the Reichstag. And so the government cannot get anything done. So as a consequence, the government under the Chancellor Brüning, who's the SDP leader, resort to a use of Article 48 to get laws passed through the Reichstag. If you remember from last video, Article 48 is this measure in the Constitution that the president can pass a law by decree in emergency, as an emergency measure if necessary. This would be considered to be an emergency given that the country's facing economic crisis. Bruning uses Article 48, or has to rely on Article 48 to push laws through the Reichstag, or to have laws created over 100 times between 1931 and 1932. So we're now basically getting government by decree, not through the Reichstag, because they can't get anything through there. So the government's doing terribly. So as a consequence, the Depression directly leads to the Nazis significantly increasing their vote share, as well as a collapse in the support for more moderate parties. So very simply, all the factors that I've talked about, you can explain how those helped to make the Nazi Party more popular and help them gain support. Additionally, the Depression has a second really important consequence and impact, which benefits the Nazis disproportionately. Not everybody is backing the Nazis because of their support for Nazi policies. The problem is the communists are also gaining support as a consequence of the Depression, okay? And this means that the Nazis are now gaining a lot more support from middle and upper class individuals, both in terms of their votes, but also financially as well. So obviously, if you're middle or upper class and you own land or a business, the one thing you fear the most is a communist revolution. And so with this increased fear of a communist takeover, the Nazis, obviously, because they themselves are virulently, sort of militantly anti-communist and want to basically crush communism, they were seen to be the party that could be trusted the most to deal with communists. And so they therefore got those votes, and they get massive donations from wealthy industrialists who would love nothing more than to see communism being crushed, okay? So for many people, the Nazis are the necessary evil to deal with the communists. Now, that's the sort of outside factors which the Nazis had no control over. Ultimately, why are the Nazis the ones who are best positioned to take advantage of the Depression? And there's a few reasons here. The first reason is the point we talked about at the very beginning of the video about charisma. Hitler ultimately has very strong personal appeal. He continues to be, things have not changed, a very charismatic speaker. And he's particularly effective, especially at this time, at showing that he understood people's problems. And unsurprising, given that he himself was somebody who was homeless, he was somebody who was able to communicate and really understand in quite an empathetic way the struggles of the average German during this very, very difficult time. Additionally, the Nazis make quite effective use of new technology to really make the best use of Hitler as a leader by using planes to fly Hitler around Germany and attend a large number of rallies. Why can he afford those planes to go around everywhere? Because, if we mentioned on the previous slide, the Nazis are getting these very large donations from wealthy businessmen. So these two things are working hand in hand. That money means the Nazis can now campaign in quite a large-scale organized way. So he flies over Germany and he attends loads and loads of rallies in the build-up to elections. So Hitler is speaking directly to hundreds of thousands of people in these election cycles. So they're making best use of their best asset, which is Hitler himself. They also make really prominent, or he's a prominent part of their poster campaigns as well. So posters typically tend to have Hitler on them, or aspects of his personality, as well as using radio broadcasts to further promote him as well. So Hitler himself is used extensively to promote the party, and they're able to use him quite effectively as well. Additionally, the style of propaganda, again, we mentioned previously that Goebbels perfects this over the course of his years in Berlin, is just very, very effective. So you first of all have the sheer size of the rallies that Hitler is attending and having people attend. So the energy of the rallies, the scale of them just looks very, very impressive, and therefore gives the impression of a person who's very popular, and therefore that gets more popularity. But also, the key thing is that propaganda for the Nazis, mentioned beforehand, is really simple, okay? The Nazis have these very generalized slogans that do not go into the specifics of what their policies will actually entail. This makes it very difficult to criticize them because they're not actually proposing very specific policies which can be unpicked and basically shown to have significant issues or drawbacks with them. Um, yeah, so that's a big part of it. Additionally, I've not mentioned it here. Within that, they also get this very negative campaigning tactics as well that go in terms of these very simple messages, blaming the Jews, blaming communists, etc. You also get the SA. Now, it may seem a bit strange to think that the SA, this private military, can help the Nazis win an election, but they've got several benefits in terms of this election cycles. Number one, that confidence that the Nazis can deal with the communists comes from the strength and size of the SA. So the SA is very large in size, and they also are relatively disciplined. Yes, they can commit some, violent acts here and there, but it's generally under commands and orders. It's not random violence mostly. And as a consequence, the Nazis seem quite strong and capable of maintaining order. So when you've got violence in the streets and chaos, this group that has this large private army who seem quite organized and disciplined seem like a group that can keep the country under control and restore order, or law and order rather. As a consequence, this also gives the impression that they can deal with the communists. So it's got a dual effect. They can deal with law and order, and also, again, it creates this impression that they're quite strong and are the ones who can match the communists and crush them as well. Now, that's the more legal side of things, I suppose you can say. The less legal side of things is that the Nazis also use the SA to heavily intimidate opponents and disrupt their actions. That can be things like tearing down posters, disrupting rallies, and, things like that, basically. The SA is also used by the Nazis to run some charitable activities. So the Nazis run soup kitchens and also hostels. They're able to do that because they have this large force, the SA, who can be used to do that for them. So again, the SA plays quite an important role in terms of giving the Nazis some support. So as a consequence, the Nazis are able to massively grow in support and take over, and become the largest party in the Reichstag. So if you had a general 10-mark question about why they were able to gain support, those are the things you could talk about. So either the outside factors, so the depression, the government's failures, the rise of communism, but then also the party's own strengths itself. How he becomes chancellor, however, is a different question. Okay, so part of the reason why he becomes chancellor is because, of course, he has the largest party in the Reichstag. However, again, if you go back to the first video, the very start of it, when we discussed the constitution, becoming the largest party in the Reichstag does not automatically make your leader the chancellor. The chancellor is chosen and appointed by the president, who can also sack the chancellor as well. And so by 1932, this is the situation. Hindenburg is surrounded by these two fellow right-wing generals, okay? One of whom is a member of the Reichstag, a guy called Franz von Papen, and the other one is called Kurt von Schleicher, okay? And these two individuals, like Hindenburg, are also, they are skeptical about Weimar democracy, not least because of these struggles it had been having and suffering from after the Depression. So they're scheming, along with Hindenburg, to try to form a new government and, solve the crisis. In particular, Schleicher is really quite particular in terms of suggesting ideas to Hindenburg and coming up with things which they can possibly do. So their first idea is they need to remove Brüning, who they think is basically has to go, and they make von Papen the chancellor instead. Okay, now having no majority in the Reichstag, von Papen cannot do a particularly good job, and so after Brüning resigns, elections are triggered 2 months later in July 1932. What these three men were not predicting is those elections would return a significant Nazi victory. So this is the election where the Nazis go from having 130 seats-ish, I think that's the number, to 230. Well, I think it was 103, something like that. And so as a consequence of this election, Hitler gains 230 seats. He's the largest party by far. He expects to be appointed chancellor. However, there is no chance of Hindenburg doing this, and part of the reason is the background stuff we talked about at the very beginning. So I discussed it as background because it helps you understand why the events go the way that they do. Hindenburg, from his name, von Hindenburg, is a rich aristocrat. He is a former army general. Okay, Hitler is a corporal. He's from a very kind of lower class family. He's uneducated. He's a former homeless individual, etc. And so there is a class element to this. Hindenburg despises Hitler because he thinks of him as basically what he calls, this is the phrase he often uses behind closed doors, a lowly Bohemian corporal. Okay? So Hindenburg, in his mind, there is no way in hell he's going to appoint this upstart as Chancellor of Germany. Even if they have quite a few shared ideas, he personally detests Hitler because of his social background, not because of his terrible views, but in case you're thinking Hindenburg's a hero, nothing to do with that. It's because of his social background. Well, largely because of his social background. So Hitler is demanding that Hindenburg sack von Papen and replace von Papen with Hitler himself. Hindenburg refuses. So Hindenburg allows von Papen to continue in his role. However, obviously he struggles to kind of control the Reichstag and do anything really. And so elections are once again triggered in November. Now, this is actually by design. Hindenburg and von Papen and Schleicher think to themselves that actually, if we wait a few more months, we can trigger a new election. The Nazis will fall off in support because they're not doing much in terms of their position in the Reichstag. But that gamble actually works. At the next election, the Nazis lose quite a few seats. They drop to 196. However, despite that, they are still the largest party in the Reichstag by a big distance. So the problem has not gone away. Hitler's main case has not evaporated. He still believes that he should be the Chancellor and that he is the only rightful choice for Chancellor. And so what happens next is you get this series of agreements and negotiations between different individuals. So in December 1932, Schleicher now convinces Hindenburg that von Papen has failed and he should instead make von Schleicher the Chancellor instead. Hindenburg is outraged and feels betrayed because he basically is by von Schleicher, who appears to have been scheming essentially against him to get what he wanted. And so he's now out, but now really upset. Like von Papen, by January, Schleicher is struggling to control the Reichstag and he cannot command any support in there. And so Schleicher actually tries to convince Hindenburg to suspend the constitution and declare a military dictatorship. So Schleicher is basically in his own little world, suggesting all kinds of crazy ideas and beliefs and suggestions. Hindenburg does not go along with this. At the same time, Hitler makes a deal with von Papen. Hitler realizes that von Papen's basically been scorned and sees the opportunity to, get an ally in the government. And he basically makes a secret deal with von Papen. And as a consequence, von Papen goes to Hindenburg and convinces him that he can appoint Hitler Chancellor. If he makes von Papen the Vice-Chancellor, von Papen will be able to control Hitler. And therefore, he's Chancellor, but will control him. And again, this may seem in hindsight like a very silly idea, but if you think back to the situation in January 1933, with this agreement, Hitler and the Nazis are only given 3 roles in the cabinet or the government. So they only get 3 ministerial positions, including Hitler himself. So the bulk of the government is still made up of non-Nazis. So it's not unreasonable to think that they could have controlled Hitler. And so on the 30th of January 1933, Hindenburg appoints Hitler the Chancellor of Germany. He takes over Germany through purely legal means. Okay, he's elected as the largest party in the Reichstag. That gives him a platform to then become the Chancellor of Germany. So up to this point in time, this is all legal. Okay. However, this is not the end of the story. So as I mentioned, in 1933, the start of 1933, you could have reasonably thought that Hitler would not be someone who would last long and that he would eventually be removed and fail as a leader potentially. He is in a very weak position, arguably. Firstly, the Constitution still strictly limits the powers of the Chancellor, so there's not much he can do without getting through the Reichstag. He is still well short of a majority in the Reichstag, so he can't do whatever he wants to do because the Nazis haven't got the numbers in the Reichstag to do that. And as I mentioned beforehand, only 3 of 12 members of the cabinet are Nazis. However, over the next 18 months, Hitler is presented with opportunities to gradually increase his power, which he does over the course of the next 18 months. And so within 18 months, he has made himself an all-powerful dictator who has completely destroyed Weimar democracy. So the other big 10-mark question you can get is, what is the main or most significant factor in Hitler's consolidation of power, basically? So we call this process of becoming a dictator the consolidation of power. Be aware of that phrase because you can get a question asked in a range of different ways with different phrases to refer to this. So this all begins in 1933 or 27th of February with the Reichstag fire. Now, if you look at it, this event seems all too convenient, but from what we understand, it was a genuine event. There was no conspiracy here. This genuinely happened. But Hitler was given a chance and he took it with both hands and basically used it to significantly increase his support across the country. So a young communist supporter, a young Dutch communist supporter, burns down the Reichstag building, or sets it on fire and burns it down. He gets captured. He's found on the scene of the crime with matchsticks, basically, and he confesses to the crime. He's tried, found guilty, and executed. And he probably did do it, to be honest. However, what appears to have been the case is this was just a lone wolf attack, and that actually there was no greater conspiracy. However, the Nazis obviously seized the opportunity to claim that a communist conspiracy was in fact unfolding, and as a consequence, the Nazis arrest 4,000 communists that same night as a consequence of the Reichstag fire burning down. But more importantly, this is the real significance of the Reichstag fire. Hitler convinces Hindenburg to declare a state of emergency, which means that Hitler can now rule by decree, and is given, crucially, two powers as a consequence of this new emergency state. Number one, he can arrest his political opponents without trial or charge, and he's also able to ensure, as a consequence, that the police ignore any SA violence. Okay, so he's got emergency powers. He uses that to make the police ignore his own supporters, violent actions, and he also starts to arrest and round up his opponents as well. He uses this to give him an advantage at a next election. So Hitler convinces Hindenburg to call a snap election a week later on March the 5th. And because of the emergency powers that Hitler had from the Reichstag fire, Hitler is able to give himself massive advantages in that election. So he's able to arrest all the communists, basically, and the SA are able to violently campaign and intimidate opponents and things like that, which means that the Nazis are able to do quite well at this election. The Nazis then secure 288 seats in the Reichstag, just short of a majority, but it's their best result yet. You couldn't say it's a free and fair election, because it's not. Basically, they've used intimidation tactics and arresting their opponents to undermine them, but he gains significant support. As a consequence, again, of his emergency powers, Hitler is able to then ban the Communist Party from taking up the 81 seats they had won in the Reichstag. So Hitler has 288 seats, he's short of a majority. The Communists have 81, but he bans them from attending, meaning he now de facto has a majority in the Reichstag, because there's 81 MPs or seats that are not being taken up. He now finds himself, as a consequence of the Reichstag fire, in a position to radically alter the constitution of Germany. Why is that? If you wanted to make a fundamental change to the constitution of Germany, you needed to have a 2/3 majority in the Reichstag. Okay? Hitler is now in a position to achieve the 2/3 through a variety of methods and measures. He passes this change. It's known as the Enabling Act. It's got a different name, but we call it the Enabling Act. And it's an act which basically, or a law, allows Hitler to pass any law he wants without consulting the Reichstag, and he can even overrule the constitution. So to clarify, the Enabling Act means Hitler can pass any law he wants without anyone else's prior approval. Okay, it's giving him massive, effectively dictatorial powers. How does he pass this, and why does it link to the Reichstag fire? So as I say, he needs a 2/3 majority to pass this act. And he does this through a variety of methods. So if you exclude the KPD, who he's chucked out of the Reichstag and basically arrested all of their members, that then gets him close to the majority. He then convinces one of the parties that was sort of like more centrist, right-leaning, called the Catholic Center Party, to support his law. He does this by making a deal with the Catholic Party, where essentially he will allow them to keep control of their schools. And basically, when he gains his significant powers, their schools can stay independent, and in exchange they'll vote for his law. Bear that in mind, because later on when we look at religion in the next topic and the church, that's why the Catholics initially get a good deal, because Hitler made a deal with them at the outset of his rule, which is why he kind of waits a few years before betraying them. So initially he keeps that deal. In addition, so that this is up until now technically all legal. In addition, what he also does is he has the SA and the SS present during the vote to intimidate members. And there are people shouting outside the chambers threats against Reichstag members, so that if you dare, so you're going to this Reichstag chamber to vote for this law or against this law potentially, but you're doing so with the shouting and intimidation of SA and SS members outside the chamber. And so Despite that, it is still technically legal because they're not being forced to vote. The other methods are technically legal. So the law ends up passing by 444 votes to 94. And this basically ends democratic rule in Germany for good. Hitler is now a dictator. As a consequence of his dictatorial powers, Hitler is able to then significantly increase his support and also weed out opposition very, very quickly. So he goes about using his powers, removing all potential sources of opposition, the main three being the following. The first are the trade unions. Okay, so the trade unions, this collection of workers who collectively come together to try and, go on strike, negotiate better conditions, etc. They are obviously a large organization that can potentially be a threat to Hitler, but in particular, the trade unions tended to be left-leaning and often had communist sympathies and links to communist parties. So, as a consequence, they get banned in May 1933, their leaders are all arrested, and strikes are all now made illegal. So he's shut down a massive potential source of opposition to the Nazis. If you recall, at the start of the 1920s, when you had the Cap Putsch and the Ruhr crisis, it was a common method to try and have the workers go on strike and refuse to work. So workers can collectively bring down governments. So using the Enabling Act, he bans the trade unions, which makes obviously opposition much weaker towards him. Secondly, he bans all political parties and declares that the NSDAP is the only legal party in Germany. Okay, so the SDP and the rest are all made completely illegal and they're no longer allowed to function at all. So Germany is now officially a one-party state. This is less significant, but it's still quite important. Hitler abolishes the regional parliaments in Germany, which had a variety of different functions which could be used against the government potentially. So he abolishes the regional governments in January 1934, again using his enabling powers, or the powers given by the Enabling Act, and instead they are replaced by governors who rule over the regions that are appointed by Hitler directly. Okay, so again, massively increasing his own support. So ultimately, the law that makes Hitler a dictator is the Enabling Act. By 1934, the start of it even, he is a dictator who is all-powerful. However, this is not the end of the story. Although he is now all-powerful and dictator, he can still potentially be challenged, okay? Not through legal means, so he's not going to lose any elections or contest them. Just because you're a dictator, that does not mean you can't be overthrown. So he does still have some potential power rivals. And this takes us into the final part of this topic, which is the Night of the Long Knives, which this is important to understand because it's a factor in that question of how he takes over Germany. You could also get specific 10-mark questions just about the Night of the Long Knives because it's a really big event. And again, it might seem a bit strange. Why is it so important given he's already the dictator? It's all about power dynamics, okay? So by the end of 1934, he is all-powerful. He's a dictator, but he's not all-powerful because there are still rivals for power who could potentially challenge him, okay? There's two main groups here that Hitler's really concerned about. The first is he's got potential rivals within the Nazi party itself. In particular, the leader of the SA, Ernst Röhm. I'll discuss it more in a second. He's become an increasingly dangerous opponent for Hitler for a variety of reasons that I'll come on to in a moment. The second group, now this is really a threat to any leader. You can be in a democratic country even, but any country you're in, and basically put it this way. If you're the army in any country in the world, if you're a general, you can wake up one day and decide, you know what, I fancy being president. All you have to do, I mean, it's not as simple as this, but all you have to do is go into your barracks, gather some supporters, gather a few generals, hatch together a plot, you send your soldiers into the street and you arrest the government, kick them out, whatever it is, declare state of emergency and you can take over. So in most countries across the world, the army genuinely has the ability whenever they want to take over the country. Quite a scary thought when you think about it. And that was obviously quite common in the early 20th century as well. I mean, as I mentioned beforehand, Schleicher had been suggesting to Hindenburg that he use the army to declare a state of emergency to suspend the constitution. So it's not a crazy idea. So the army is also a potential threat to Hitler who could overthrow him. And this isn't a crazy idea. They were suspicious of him. And they were technically, though not in reality, but they were technically under the control of Hindenburg, who as president was the head of the armed forces. So they were in reality a threat. So the Night of the Long Knives, Hitler is able to consolidate his power totally by dealing with both of these two issues, okay? By the end of this year, he no longer has any major power rivals or threats to his power. So why is this the case? Or what is the threat here? So the reason why the Night of the Long Knives happens, so you can get a 10-mark question about the main reasons why the Night of the Long Knives happens, okay? So the first reason is basically the threat of Rome and the SA. So why is Rome a threat? So we mentioned that beforehand that the SA had reached 800,000 members by 1930. Over the course of the next 3 years, it swells even further, and by 1933, the SA now has 3 million members. These members are largely loyal to Rome, okay? Even though Hitler is the head of the party, the head of the SA is Rome. Not only are they largely loyal to Rome, they are also increasingly feeling quite bitter about the ways in which the Nazi party had been changing from their perspective for the worse. They felt that Hitler was undervaluing them as a force, okay? So you have this bitter force, the SA, feeling undervalued by Hitler, loyal to Rome. Rome himself has also now become increasingly a massive threat. This is a person who initially is a close ally to Hitler. He brings him into the party. They're very close friends as well at one point in time, or, say friends, close allies. However, Rome himself starts to publicly oppose Hitler's policies and criticize him. Again, we go back to Bamberg, and we go back to the rich industrialists, National Socialists. The Nazi party has this constant tension between, are they nationalist or socialist, and in what measure are they both of those two things? Rome and the SA are these former industrial workers in many cases who tended to believe that the party should support the workers and wanted to see more of these socialist leanings instead. And so Rome believed that Hitler had abandoned the party's working class supporters and instead was cozying up to rich industrialists and army generals. And he had also publicly criticized Hitler. So this wasn't something secretive. He had publicly made comments about the way the party was going. So he's clearly now a potential threat, potential enemy as well to Hitler. So whether or not he intended to overthrow Hitler, we don't know for sure. But Hitler clearly had good reason to fear Rome and want to remove him and or the SA as well, okay? Now, to add to that, we have a second reason that the Long Knives happened. So you could argue that they were genuinely a threat, but there's also the internal power struggles within the government and the party that meant that Hitler was convinced by other forces to move against Rome. So the first thing is the German army. So the German army had also increasingly been worried about Rome because they believed, and he had said this publicly or suggested this, that he intended to replace the German army with the SA. So as a consequence, their loyalty to Hitler was weaker as a result of the existence of the SA, who they believed were a threat to them as the army. Additionally, you also had leaders of the SS like Himmler, who saw Rome as a power rival within the party itself, and they wanted to remove Rome because they wanted themselves to ascend within the party. So I've mentioned really briefly, the Nazi party for its entire existence is racked by these internal power struggles between groups that are trying to gain ascendancy or Hitler's favor and rise and fall in the party. So the SS, Himmler rather, leader of the SS, and Heydrich as well, both see Rome as a power rival and want to remove him. They see the SA as an obstacle to the ascendancy of the SS within the Nazi party and Germany, and they want to basically increase their own power at the expense of Rome. So the SS leaders, basically Heydrich and Rome and Himmler, and the army both warn Hitler that Rome is planning a coup. And as a consequence, they convince Hitler to remove Rome and the SA. So you have two things happening here. On the one hand, Hitler is already feeling increasingly threatened by Rome. And then the second kind of big overall factor is that the SS and the army convince Hitler that Rome is plotting to overthrow Hitler and therefore he should remove him. And so as a consequence, Hitler decides to move against the SA and Rome and remove them. This gives us the Night of the Long Knives. So the Night of the Long Knives, very simply, Hitler arranges a meeting at a hotel in Bavaria on the 30th of June 1934, and he basically invites the leaders of the SA to this meeting. When they get there, they are promptly arrested, imprisoned, and then shot. Okay, Rome initially, when he gets imprisoned, is given the option of killing himself. He refuses, and then execute afterwards. So they try to give him the dignity of, killing himself instead. He refuses. So initially, the Night of the Long Knives is just a removal of the SA to basically close that threat of the two threats. Rome's threat himself, but also the threat of the army who are worried about Rome and the SA. And I'll discuss that more in a little bit in a second. However, Hitler decides to use the Night of the Long Knives as an opportunity to tie up any loose ends and settle other scores. So it's not just the SA leaders who get in prison executed. Hitler basically has a 4-day, or the Nazis carry out a series of murders and executions over a 4-day period where over 400 people get killed, mainly SA leaders, but other politicians and other figures who Hitler himself either thought was a potential threat or a previous enemy. So key figures also get killed. So von Schleicher gets killed in the Night of the Long Knives. There's also a chap called Gregor Strasser, who I've not mentioned, but quite a senior figure. Strasser was a northern socialist member of the Nazi party, quite a senior figure in the party, who had very similar socialist beliefs and leanings to Rome, and so for the same reason was seen to be a potential threat or someone to remove that, and Hitler disliked him anyway. The SA itself continues to exist, but it's reduced in significance and size and is now firmly under Hitler's control as a consequence of the Night of the Long Knives. So how does this contribute to the consolidation of power? There's 3 main reasons. The first thing is it removes a wide range of figures that could have been a threat to Hitler or an opponent of him, in particular Rome, plus a few others. Secondly, shortly after the Night of the Long Knives, like I think about a month later in August, I think it's August 34, so just over a month later, Hindenburg suddenly dies of old age. He was in his late 80s, he was quite sick, so he dies. When he dies, Hitler declares himself the Führer, and as a consequence, he merges the president and chancellor's position together into one role. The Führer basically means the leader. But as a consequence of the Night of the Long Knives, so we mentioned that there's 2 rivals to power, the SA, but also the army. Removing the SA gives or gains Hitler the trust of the army, who now are more comfortable with having Hitler in charge, and therefore the threat of their rebellion or potential overthrow has now been reduced significantly. Having done that, after Hindenburg's death, he then requires all soldiers to swear an oath of loyalty to Hitler to protect him and serve him, whatever else. Okay, so you now have Hitler being A, a dictator, but B, he's also now removed any potential threat or serious opposition or opponent to him. So the consolidation of power is in 2 stages, becoming a dictator and then removing opposition. So by 34, he has now become all-powerful, and he'll remain that way largely until the end of his rule at the end of the Second World War. And that's the end of that topic. So if we go over that topic all over again, so the main things are, so in terms of 10-mark questions, you can get a wide range of topics. So it could be about the Munich Putsch. You could get something about the Night of the Long Knives specifically, but these are less common. The 2 that are most common are ultimately something about the consolidation of power in terms of why it happened, or the most significant factors, and also the reason why the Nazis were able to take over and Hitler was able to become Chancellor by 1933. In terms of 40-mark questions, those are also the 2 big ones. Okay, so it's either going to be something about the takeover of Germany just in general, or the consolidation of power. Okay, I hope that was useful and that was all really clear and kind of fairly straightforward. If you've got any questions about anything that I talked about, want any further clarifications or kind of particular questions you can get, just leave a question in the comment section below, and I'll hope to get back to you as soon as I can. And look out for the next video that should hopefully be dropping as well on the final part of the topic in the next few days as well on life in Nazi Germany.